For centuries, it was the most valuable plant in the ancient world. Kings taxed it, poets wrote about it, physicians called it a miracle. And then, one day, it was simply gone. Not endangered, not rare, extinct. But what if the story didn't end there? What if, buried in the fossil record, something of that plant survived? Not the plant itself, but its chemistry, waiting 15 centuries to be read again. This is the story of Silphium, and this is what modern science thinks it might have found in its shadow. Somewhere between legend and ledger, this plant sits in a strange position in history. It is not a myth like Atlantis, not a rumor passed down through unreliable storytellers. It shows up in tax records, it shows up in trade manifests, it shows up on government currency. And it still disappeared so completely that today not a single confirmed living specimen exists anywhere on Earth. That combination, thoroughly documented and totally gone, is almost unheard of in botanical history. Most extinctions we know about are inferred from gaps in the fossil record, reconstructed centuries after the fact. Silphium's extinction was watched, in something close to real time, by the very civilization that depended on it. To understand how strange this story is, you have to understand how important Silphium once was. It grew in a single narrow strip of coastline in what is now eastern Libya, in the ancient region called Cyrenaica. Nowhere else on Earth, according to the ancient sources. Not inland, not across the sea in Greece or Italy, despite repeated attempts to transplant it. Greek and Roman writers described it as a resinous, thick-stemmed plant, something like a giant fennel, whose sap was harvested by hand, dried into a hardened resin, and shipped across the Mediterranean for centuries as one of the ancient world's most sought-after commodities. It was used as a seasoning, prized enough that a small amount could season an entire feast. It was used as a perfume base, but mostly it was used as medicine, for coughs, for fever, for digestive ailments, for wound care, and, according to multiple ancient medical writers, for chronic pain and inflammation of the joints, the kind of ailment that had no reliable treatment anywhere else in the ancient pharmacy. Some historians believe its image was so tied to wealth and health that it appeared stamped on the coinage of Cyrene itself, sometimes alongside the goddess associated with the city. A plant, on money, next to a deity. That alone tells you something about what it was worth to the people who depended on it. The city of Cyrene built much of its early wealth on this single export. Trade routes formed around it. Entire family fortunes were tied to its harvest. And because it apparently could not be successfully cultivated outside its narrow native range, every recorded attempt to farm it elsewhere reportedly failed. Its supply was always fragile, always finite, always one bad harvest away from catastrophe. And then, by the 1st century CE, Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote what may be the saddest line in ancient botany, that only a single stalk of true Silphium had been found in living memory, and it had been sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity, a museum piece rather than a crop. After that, nothing. No confirmed sighting, no surviving seed bank, no herbarium sample anyone can point to with certainty. Silphium is widely considered the first plant in recorded history whose extinction was documented in real time by the people who watched it happen. Overharvesting drove the collapse. Overgrazing by livestock stripped what regrowth might have occurred. A narrow, unforgiving habitat never had room for error. It didn't fade over geological time, the way most plant extinctions unfold. It disappeared in a matter of human generations, inside a span of time people alive at the start of the story could have lived to see the end of. For nearly 2,000 years, that was the end of the story. Here's the problem that quietly bothered botanists for centuries. Silphium wasn't a myth. It wasn't Atlantis. It was a documented, traded, taxed agricultural commodity with a known growing region and a known collapse timeline. which means somewhere in that region, its genetic relatives should still exist. Plants don't vanish from an ecosystem without leaving cousins behind. Researchers have long suspected that Silphium belonged to the Ferula genus, close relatives of what we now call giant fennel, plants still growing wild across parts of North Africa and the Mediterranean today. Some botanists have proposed candidates like Ferula tingitana as possible living relatives, sharing a similar resin, a similar growth habit, a similar chemical family. If that connection is real, then Silphium's chemistry didn't necessarily disappear completely the day the last stalk was cut. It may have simply gone quiet, diluted across related species that never got the attention Silphium did, because they weren't the ones stamped onto ancient coins, weren't the ones taxed by an empire, weren't the ones written about by Roman naturalists. That single idea is the hinge this whole story turns on. Extinction of a named plant does not always mean extinction of its underlying chemistry. A species can vanish while its molecular blueprint survives, scattered and diluted, in cousins nobody thought to look at closely. It raises an uncomfortable question for botanists and historians alike. How many other extinct plants aren't actually gone in the way we assume, but simply lost their identity inside a family tree we never finished mapping? Now here's where this story leaves the confirmed historical record and enters speculative territory, the part of this video that is a thought experiment, not a settled scientific finding. Imagine a research team studying dried botanical specimens and fossilized plant resin recovered from an archaeological dig near the old Cyrenaican coastline. Imagine that among degraded plant material, pollen traces, resin residue, carbonized seed fragments, they managed to recover partial ancient DNA and cross-reference its genetic fingerprint against living ferula relatives still growing in the region today. And imagine what they find is a compound family, rare sesquiterpene lactones, a class of plant chemical already known in related species for having anti-inflammatory properties, but present in unusually concentrated form in the reconstructed profile, potent enough to explain, at least partially, why ancient physicians reached for this plant again and again for pain and swelling of the joints. This is the moment every documentary like this one hinges on, the moment a silent, extinct plant seems to speak again, through fragments, through chemistry, through the DNA of its closest living relatives. Picture the resin sample under laboratory light, thousands of years old, brittle and dark, finally giving up a readable genetic sequence after centuries of silence. Picture the researchers cross-referencing that sequence against a modern ferula specimen collected just a few hundred kilometers from where the ancient trade routes once ran, watching the overlap appear on a screen. And imagine what they find is a compound family, rare sesquiterpene lactones, a class of plant chemical already known in related species for having anti-inflammatory properties, but present in unusually concentrated form in the reconstructed profile. Potent enough to explain, at least partially, why ancient physicians reached for this plant again and again for pain and swelling of the joints, for chronic ailments that modern medicine still struggles to treat without significant side effects. To be clear, no verified peer-reviewed study has successfully sequenced confirmed Silphium DNA to date. What does exist is real, ongoing scientific interest in Ferula family plants and their anti-inflammatory compounds, a genuinely active area of ethnobotanical research, with actual published papers screening these plants for bioactive potential. The bridge between ancient extinct plant and modern miracle compound in this script is the speculative narrative leap, the what if, not a documented medical breakthrough. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this video, because the moment a what if gets mistaken for a confirmed result, the story stops being history and starts being misinformation. Even as speculation, this idea does real work because it points to something true and underappreciated. Plant extinction is not always a closed door. Botanists estimate that a significant fraction of flowering plant species faces extinction risk within this century, many of them before we've catalogued their basic chemistry, let alone their medicinal potential. Every extinct or endangered plant may be carrying a chemical library that never gets opened. Willow bark gave us the precursor to aspirin. The Pacific yew tree gave modern oncology paclitaxel, one of the most widely used chemotherapy drugs in history, extracted from a species once considered a trash tree, cleared out of old-growth forests without a second thought. The rosy periwinkle of Madagascar gave us treatments for certain childhood leukemias, discovered only because researchers happened to study a plant already used in traditional medicine. These are not speculative. These are documented cases where a plant nearly lost to habitat destruction, or already treated as a nuisance, turned out to hold real pharmaceutical value that changed modern medicine. In each case, the compound had been sitting in the plant's chemistry the entire time, waiting for someone to ask the right question before a bulldozer, a market, or a changing climate closed the window for good. Silphium may be the oldest cautionary tale in written history, a plant whose disappearance was watched, recorded, and mourned by the very civilization that used it up, in real time, with no ambiguity about what was being lost. And its cousins, still growing quietly today along Mediterranean hillsides and North African slopes, may be our only remaining way to ask it what it knew, if anyone ever bothers to look closely enough and carefully enough to find out. This is not purely hypothetical work. Ethnobotanists and pharmacologists do actively study ferula species today, screening their compounds for anti-inflammatory and analgesic activity, in the same slow, careful, peer-reviewed way most real drug discovery happens. Years of laboratory screening, animal studies, and eventually, if a compound is promising enough, human clinical trials. It is not a straight line from ancient plant to modern cure, and any documentary or article that tells you otherwise is skipping the hardest, slowest, most important part of the process. What makes Silphium worth telling this story about isn't a hidden miracle cure. It's a reminder of the stakes. A plant this economically and medically important to an entire ancient civilization vanished within a few human generations, and we are still, 2,000 years later, trying to reconstruct what we lost. That should change how we think about the plants disappearing right now. In real time, in rainforests and coastlines and mountain ranges, we have barely begun to study. There is something humbling in this story that has nothing to do with pain relief or pharmacology. It's about memory, the kind stored not in books, but in biology. Every plant species carries millions of years of chemical experimentation, evolved defenses and adaptations that no laboratory could design from scratch. When a species disappears, we don't just lose a plant, we lose a library that took millions of years to write and that we will never get to read again. Silphium is the oldest known example of that loss being witnessed and recorded by the people who caused it. That's what makes it different from every other extinction story. We don't have to imagine what was lost, the Romans told us, in detail, on their coins and in their writing. We just weren't listening closely enough to notice we could still be losing something similar today. The flower on the coin is gone, but its family is still out there, growing quietly in places we've stopped paying attention to. Maybe the real question isn't whether Silphium's secrets can ever be fully recovered. Maybe it's how many other plants are disappearing right now before we've even learned to ask them the same question.